This week's parsha, Parshas Vayetze, is the parsha of Golus. It's one lengthy depiction of Yaakov's 20 years in Golus, in Eretz Yisrael, in the house of Lava. We generally think of Golus as an einesh. It's a punishment. The Mishnah Pirkei Avos says that Golus ha'aretz comes from Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz, Shvichas Damim, Shmitas ha'aretz. There are specific aveiros for which the einesh is Golus. In the case of Yaakov Avinu, we don't find that his Golus was an einesh. Interestingly, we do find that he was chayav an einesh. He was liable for a punishment. There's a fascinating Medrash Rabbah in last week's parsha, which says on the pasuk that when Esav heard that Yitzchak had given the brachas to Yaakov, it says that Esav cried out a sa'aka gedoylu umara ad ma'od, a very bitter cry. So in that pasuk, the Medrash Rabbah says that Kala Imra Kadosh Baruch Hu Vatron, whoever says that Kadosh Baruch Hu overlooks Averis, Yivatru B'nei Ma'ahi, that person should give up his intestines. Whatever that means exactly. Says why? Because it's not so. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Marechaf, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is patient. The Gavi delays, but sooner or later he pays back. Where do we see that Yaakov was paid back? We find generations later a great grandson of Yaakov, Mordechai, in the Megillah, gave out also a very bitter cry because of something that a great grandson of Esav had done. Haman masterminded the decree against Klal Yisrael, and Mordechai also, by Isaac Za'aka Gedoylu Umara, he cried out a bitter cry. So the Medrash says this was a payment for the cry that Esav cried because of what Yaakov had done to him. So the Medrash says that there was a payback. But just as an aside, what is the idea of this paying back? Because why was Yaakov liable for what he had done to Esav after all said and done? Yaakov's taking the blessings was Alpi Rivka, was a Neviah, she had Ruach HaKodesh, certainly was justified. Because why should Yaakov have had any punishment? Why should there be any consequences for what he did? So the Tziv says in last week's parsha a very amazing thing. Now, the Gemara says that there's such a thing as an Aveira Lishma. There's an Aveira that a person does for just cause. The Gemara says that Gedoyla Aveira Lishma Yosem Mitzvah Shloi Lishma. That an Aveira which is done for the right reason can even be greater than a mitzvah done for the wrong reason. So the Gemara gives an example when Yael seduced Sisera, the general of the Canaanim, which resulted in the salvation of the Jews. So the Gemara says this is considered an Aveira Lishma. It was something which normally would be usher to do, but it was justified because of Pikuach Nefesh. So the Gemara asks a question, V'hakam es Hanya me'Aveira? She had Hanoah from the Aveira. She had pleasure. So the Gemara says, no, Kol Teivasan Shel Rishayim Roahi Eitel Sadikim. The pleasure that Rishayim give is considered an evil to the tzaddikim. They have no pleasure from it. So therefore she wasn't mishana mi'aveira. So Taisus explains in Nazir that what is the pshat in the Gemara's kasha? The Gemara's kasha is not that if she had anah it wouldn't have been justified. She was allowed to do what she did for Pikuach Nefesh, to save Klal Yisrael. But she wouldn't have been praised for it. She wouldn't have been praised for it. If I see she's praised for what she did, it must be she had no hana at all. And this, the Mitzvah, derives a general principle. That when it comes to doing an Aveira Lishma, something which normally would be usher, and you're doing it for just cause, it has to be altruistic. It has to be purely l'shem shemayim. If there's any element of personal satisfaction in it that undermines and compromises the whole idea of the Aveira Lishma. I think we once gave an example of this. The Chafetz Chaim says a tremendous chidush that when it comes to saying something which normally would be lashon hara for a te'eles, let's say you have to convey information to prevent the person from suffering harm or loss. So there are many conditions that have to be met. So one of the conditions that has to be met, says the Chafetz Chaim, is you have to do it totally for the purpose of saving that individual, the person you're speaking to, from harm or loss. It can't have even a mashu, even the smallest amount of satisfaction at slandering that person. Meaning if the person you're speaking about is a person you happen not to like, you have a dilemma. Because you're going to have some satisfaction in slandering him, and that is a forbidden kavanah. You have to have kavanah only 1,000% to save the person from loss or harm. What is the basis of this? Well, this concept. Since lashon hara normally is aser, and you're only doing it in this instance because there's a justification, it has to be totally for that justification. If you have any personal pleasure in it, it undermines the concept of Aveira Lishma. So it says in the Tziv that here too, because Yaakov Avinu did something which normally would be forbidden, to exercise, to use ramos, to use deception, to gain advantage, normally would be awesome. Here there was a heter, it was al pi bitka, neviah, ruach hakodesh, whatever the heter was, but it's a thing that normally would be awesome. Says the Nesiv that Yaakov Avinu had some satisfaction from it. He had some personal satisfaction, and that marred, that blemished the Aveira Lishma, so to speak. And for that there had to be a kapara. What was the kapara? That hundreds of years later, a grandson of Yaakov would cry out a za'aka g'dayla umara as a retribution for the za'aka that Esav cried in this instance. Just as an aside, so what was the personal pleasure that Yaakov took? I don't think we should assume that Yaakov hated Esav. I'm sure he didn't admire Esav, but I don't suspect that Yaakov hated Esav. I think that if anything, the pleasure might have been something else. It says in the beginning of last week's parsha that Yaakov was ish tam yoshev ohalim. He was an ish tam. So what does ish tam mean? Rashi says a person who is not charif, who is not sharp enough, l'ramais, to fool people, that's a tam. Which means a simple person. He's simple, straightforward, not devious. In other words, the fact that Yaakov didn't have it within him to fool people is not because of some higher moral standard. At least that's not what it was assumed. It was assumed that the reason he wasn't able to do it is because he wasn't that clever, he wasn't that sharp. And it may be people even pointed this out to him, that you're a simple person, you're not devious, you're not clever in that way. So when he was able to practice this ramos, to steal the brachas from Esav, there may have been an element of personal satisfaction, not because he hated Esav, but because now he was able to think of himself as being clever, whereas beforehand it was assumed that he was rather dull and mediocre. Al Kapanim, the Nesiv says this, that there was a personal satisfaction, and that had to be paid back. But it's important to note, going back to the Medrash doesn't say that the payback was 20 years of galus. The Medrash seems to understand that the only thing that required a payment was the za'aka g'daylu mara ad ma'id, and that was paid back by Haman hundreds of years later. But the fact that he went into galus for 20 years, that the Medrash doesn't bother justifying. So it appears that that wasn't meant to be a punishment, the 20 years of galus. So what's the alternative? If it wasn't a punishment, what would it be? So we could assume that the galus was meant to be instructive, meaning it was a formative experience. There was something that Yaakov had to learn, some value he had to integrate, and that's why he had to go into galus, not so much as a punishment for a chet, but in order to serve as the founding father, so to speak, of Klal Yisrael, it was necessary to go through this experience. What was he meant to learn from this experience? In past years, we discussed this idea, and we said that it all relates to the idea of Ramos. In other words, it's true that Yaakov was justified in using Ramos to steal the brachas from Esav, but nevertheless, when a person commits an Aveira Lishma, there's always the danger of the Aveira becoming part of his Hanhaga, part of his way. And if Yaakov used Ramos in his dealings with Esav, perhaps Ramos would become a part of his personality, a part of his very being. So it was necessary to uproot Ramos from him, from himself. How do you do that? How do you uproot something negative? Well, the best way is to find yourself as the victim of it. In other words, you're not going to do something if you've experienced the bitterness of being a victim of it. And therefore, to uproot this Ramos, which he had to do in order to steal the brachas from Esav, but to ensure that it didn't become a part of him, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed that he be subjected to a 20-year experience as being the victim of Ramos. And of course, the consequence of that would be that it was totally removed from his personality. He would never engage in an act of Ramos, having felt the bitterness of what it is to be at the receiving end. And in fact, as we all know, that his dealings with Lavan were all on the up and up. And he never practiced Ramos or deception as dealing with Lavan. He was scrupulously honest, even to the extent that after 20 years, he was able to say, go through all my belongings and see, is there anything that I took of yours? And Chazal point out, how is it possible that a person could live with his father-in-law for 20 years, and when he leaves, he doesn't take anything? Like nothing just found its way into the luggage that belonged to the father-in-law. Except, of course, the truffin which Rachel took. But the idea is that he was scrupulously honest in all his dealings with Lavan. And that's perhaps because he had the bitter taste of what it means to be at the receiving end of Ramos. And that could be the reason why he had the experience of 20 years in Golus. But tonight, I'd like to propose a different possibility. There may be a different issue that had to be achieved in the 20 years of Golus in the house of Lavan. There's a sugya, a very complicated sugya in our parsha, which is the sugya of bitachon, the sugya of trust, relying on the Ribono Shel Olam. It says that Yaakov Avinu, when he was leaving Eretz Yisrael, had a dream, and in this dream there was a ladder, malachim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to him and made a set of promises. He said, V'hinei anochi imach, I am with you, u'shmarticha b'chol asher telech, I will guard you wherever you go, v'ashivosicha lo adam hazois, I'll bring you back to Eretz Yisrael. A series of promises HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes to Yaakov Avinu. And then, when he wakes up in the morning, he makes a neder. He makes a vow. And Chazal say that from this that Yaakov made a vow, we learn that there's a meritorious deed to be noder based psara. It's appropriate to make a vow in a time of crisis, time of danger, to make a pledge. You tell HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you save me, I'll do such and such, I'll give tzedakah, and that's considered a schus. It's a schus in advance, even though you ultimately only give the tzedakah after you're saved. But making the commitment is a schus, and we learn this from Yaakov Avinu. So the Medrash asks the question, why is Yaakov looking for schuyas? He had an ironclad promise from the Ribono Shel Olam. Hashem said, don't worry. I'm with you. I'll bring you back to Eretz Yisrael. And all of a sudden, Yaakov is looking for schuyas, so he makes a vow that if you help me, then I will make this stone into a mizbeach, and I'll give meiser. Why is he looking for schuyas? Why is he making vows? Because the Baruch made a promise to him. He can rely on the Ribono Shel Olam's promise. So the Medrash Rabbah says in this pasuk, from here we see she'ein havtacha letzadikim ba'olam hazeh, that there's no promise for tzadikim in this world. Tzadikim can't rely on promises. The first one the Medrash understand, the idea is, because in every promise there is an implicit t'nai, an implicit condition. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm making the promise, but it's a condition that if you are deserving of it, if you're not deserving of it, if you commit aveiros, then that will cancel the promise. And therefore, tzaddikim can't rely on the promise, and that's why Yaakov is looking for schuyas. That if you do all these things, then I will build a mizbeach and I'll give meiser. Now it's interesting that really the Gemara also says the same thing, and strangely the Gemara derives it from a different place. In next week's parsha, Parshas Vayishlach, it says that in his encounter with Esav, by Yira Yaakov Ma'od Vayetze, he was very frightened. And the Gemara asks the question, why was he frightened? In the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, as Yaakov was leaving Eretz Yisrael, Hashem made these promises to him, so the promises were still binding on his return. Why was he scared of Esav? So the Gemara says as well, Shema Yigroy Machet. He was scared that maybe he had done Averis. So this is an interesting point, that the Gemara is only bothered by the question from next week's parsha. That in light of the fact that Hashem made promises in the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, why is Yaakov scared of Esav at the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach? But the Medrash says that Minayil Bey, from Parshas Vayetze itself, we have a problem. That if he received a promise, why is he looking for schuyas to make a vow that if you do these things, I'll give meiser, etc. So again, the same answer, because Yaakov was fearful that he would sin, and therefore the promise would not be operative, and therefore he was looking for schuyas. But this is what it says. Rabbi Chanan Vasser Zecher Tzadik Levracha in the Chavis Memorim asks a very, very interesting question based on the Gemara, the Medrash, on a Rambam. There's a Rambam in the Shemona Prakim that says the following idea. He says that it isn't necessary for a Navi to be perfect in every way as a condition of receiving Nevuah. A person can receive Nevuah even if he is flawed in some area of his personality. And the Rambam goes through many of the Nevi'im in Tanakh and points out what the flaws were, and says, you see from here, that nevertheless they were able to receive Nevuah. One of the examples he gives is Yaakov Avinu. He says, Yaakov Avinu was scared of Esav. He was frightened. That's a flaw, for lack of bitachon. And you see, nevertheless, he was able to receive Nevuah. That's what the Rambam says. So, as to Rabbi Chanan, you see that the Rambam understands that Yaakov's lack of bitachon was a fault. It was a flaw. How can you say it was a flaw? The Gemara asks the question, and the Gemara says it was justified. Shema Yigrayim Hached. He was scared that perhaps he committed an Aveira and couldn't rely on the divine promise. So how could you blame him for his lack of bitachon? It was totally justified because of his fear. Shema Yigrayim Hached. So Rabbi Chanan says a very interesting answer. He says that there really are two types of bitachon. One aspect of bitachon is if you are the beneficiary of an explicit promise from the Ribono Shel Olam. If the Kadosh Baruch Hu spoke to you or through a Navi, you are the beneficiary of a promise, so obviously a person can rely on the promise. That's one aspect of bitachon. You can rely on an explicit promise. There's another aspect of bitachon. Even if a person has not received an explicit promise, there is a concept that a person can rely on the Ribono Shel Olam. If he places his trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, he can count on the Ribono Shel Olam. If a person places his trust in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, he'll be surrounded by God's kindness, even in the absence of an explicit promise. And this is the type of bitachon that we speak about. Right? None of us are Nevi'im, none of us receive Nevuah. And yet we're expected to have bitachon in the Ribono Shel Olam. That means there's a totally separate concept of bitachon, which is to place one's trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, even if we are not the beneficiaries of explicit promises. That concept of bitachon, says Rabbi Chanan, we know from Kama V'Kama Rayas, applies even to Rishoyim and Kal V'Chomer to Tzadikim She'enam Gemurim. How do we know this? Because otherwise it would be totally irrelevant. I mean, Ein Tzadik Ba'aretz Asher Yaseh Tov V'Lo Yachtav. There's no person who's totally innocent in the world. So how can anyone have bitachon? You can always say, I'm scared of that little Aveira I did, that it might make me unworthy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kindness. There's a vada, the chayvas bitachon is true even if a person is a Rosh, and certainly if the person is a tzaddik, just not a tzaddik gomer. Now why would that be? Rabbi Chanan says, because this is an aspect of the midas harachamim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed to us. There are many different aspects of midas harachamim, but one of the aspects of midas harachamim is that Hashem says, if you count on me, I won't let you down. Now it's true that al pi din a person doesn't deserve it. But that's the concept of bitachon. If you count on me, I won't let you down. And even a Rasha can do that. But he has to really put his trust in the Ribono Shel Olam. I mean, there's a story which is told of a certain guy who was asked this question by a person. He said, if I buy a lottery ticket for the big drawing, $50 million, and I place my trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, will I win? So he says, Avada, if you put your trust in Moshe, you'll win. So he says, so how come last week you didn't win? So I'll prove the point. If someone would come to you and say, I'll give you $1,000 for your ticket, would you give it to him? He says, certainly. He says, why? He says, if you have the winning ticket, $50 million, why would you give it up for $1,000? The answer is, you don't really believe you're going to win the lottery, so you figure, better make the $1,000 than make nothing. Well, that means you're not putting your trust in Ribono Shel Olam. But if you really put your trust in Ribono Shel Olam and really count on him, he wouldn't let you down. The thing is, we talking lip service, we don't really rely on him. So we're not really practicing bitachon, and that's why we're often frustrated. But if a person would mamish rely on the Ribono Shel Olam, there is a haftacha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not let you down, even if you're otherwise undeserving. And that's a function of midas harachamim. So there's two aspects of bitachon. Says Ovachanan, the Gemara was discussing the explicit promise. How was Yaakov scared of Esav? He had an explicit promise from the Ribono Shel Olam, U'shmarticha b'chol asher telech. So on that, the Gemara answers that no, the promise was not negeya. Why? Because there's an implicit t'nai that you'll only receive the promise if you're deserving, and Shema Yigrayim hachet. But the question is, forget the promise. Why didn't Yaakov have bitachon even without a promise? And that type of bitachon is even appropriate for not tzaddikim gemurim. Even if a person would have committed a chet, he could rely on that type of bitachon. So there the Rambam says, in fact, there was a flaw in the case of Yaakov's personality. Rabbi Eliezer goes on to say that lulei the Rambam, if not for the Rambam, he would have justified Yaakov's fear and would have said that it's not a flaw even in the bitachon, which is appropriate for a Rosh. Now, we're not going to go through how Rabbi Eliezer brings it out. He brings it out based on Mashallah, which is a little bit of an arichus, but I'll bring it out in a slightly different way, based on a Sfarno in this week's parsha. It says that when Yaakov Avinu made his vow, he said that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu does all these things for me, if he is with me, and he guards me, and he gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and he brings me back in peace to my father's house, then v'haya Hashem li le'elokim. Then Hashem will be for me a God. So what does it mean, v'haya Hashem li le'elokim? The Ramban says it means he'll be the object of worship. I'll serve him. The Sfarno says an amazing pshat. The Sfarno says like this: we know that the name Yud Kei Vav Kei implies midas harachamim, and we know that the name Elokim implies midas hadin. So most people in this world survive only through midas harachamim. They would not be able to meet the higher standard of midas hadin. But the great tzaddikim, they want to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu fully. They want to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu by the highest standard, that which the midas hadin calls for. And that's what what Yaakov was saying. V'haya Hashem, Hashem will be le'elokim. Hashem, the midas harachamim, will function in accordance with the midas hadin, meaning that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps these promises, I commit myself to serve him according to the higher standard of midas hadin, which is an amazing, amazing shot in the pasuk. But based on this pasuk, we can say as follows: that's why Yaakov Avinu was scared, because Yaakov made a commitment that he would be held to the higher standard of midas hadin. Al pi midas hadin, there's no room for bitachon. Because as we said, that bitachon that a person, even a Rasha, can place his trust in Ribono Shel Olam is obviously only a function of midas harachamim. That al pi midas harachamim, Hashem says, listen, you put your trust in me, you rely on me, I won't let you down. But that's certainly a function of midas harachamim. If the person is otherwise undeserving, why should HaKadosh Baruch Hu come through for him? And therefore Yaakov felt he wasn't able to tap into that bitachon because he had made a commitment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should deal with him al pi midas hadin. And therefore, there was no room for bitachon. Therefore, his fear was justified. Because since he had made that commitment to live in accordance with midas hadin, so even the slightest aveira would prevent him being the beneficiary of God's protection. So we could say that Yaakov is not to blame. Because of this commitment, he felt he could not rely on bitachon, and therefore he was fearful of Esav. But, and here's a big but, even where you have no basis for bitachon in the Ribono Shel Olam, one is still not allowed, or still one should not, place his trust in someone else. And that's a serious error. In other words, this I don't rely on human beings or money or intelligence or whatever, is not because I am meant to place my trust in the Ribono Shel Olam. It's because these things are inherently unreliable. And therefore, even if, because of my chatoim and my commitment to live al pi midas adin, I feel unjustified in putting my trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, I still would be unjustified putting my trust in someone else. And if you look at the Chayvus Levavos in the Shar HaBitachon, Perek Beis, the Chayvus Levavos has a long arichos where he discusses this idea, and he says that the reason it's a mistake to place one's trust in human beings or in money or in whatever, in superior intelligence, is not because you're meant to put your trust in the Ribono Shel Olam instead. He says because there are conditions that have to be met for relying on something, and nothing meets the conditions except for the Ribono Shel Olam. So therefore, he says it's not that putting your faith in money or putting your faith in people or in politicians or in government is wrong because there's a chiyuv to put your trust in the Ribono Shel Olam. It's wrong, it makes no sense, because these other sibos are inherently unreliable. So therefore, even if a person would justifiably feel, because of his averis, and again his commitment to live al pi midas adin, he could not place his trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, it would be appropriate to be fearful. And then you would daven and you would look for schlias, but to say, well, since I'm not putting my trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, therefore I'll put my trust in something else, that certainly wouldn't be justified. The amazing thing is that there is a Maimer Chazal, the Gemara Megillah, which seems that Yaakov Avinu was guilty just of that fault, that he placed his trust in something other than the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore Yaakov, even if we answer the Rambam's objection by saying that his fear of Esav was justified, there is another point in the story wherein he seems to place his bitachon in something which is inherently unreliable. Where? An amazing part of the story. The Gemara says in Megillah that when Yaakov first met Rachel, the Torah describes the story, it says that Yaakov proposed marriage on that occasion. So Rachel said that my father is a rabbi, my father is a man, and I have an older sister, so he's certainly going to pull some stunt to give you my older sister Leah before me. So it says in the pasuk that Yaakov told Rachel, "Ki achi aviyahu," that he is her father's brother. Now that's not true. He wasn't her father's brother. He was her father's nephew. So what does it mean when he said that I'm your father's brother? So the Gemara says, Rashi quotes it, that he said, "Achiv ani b'ramos." Don't worry, I'm his brother in trickery. He says, I already dealt with Esav. I'm a master of deception. I can hold my own with Lavan. Now, of course, we who have hindsight see how naive it was, because Lavan outsmarted him virtually at every juncture. But the point was that at that point in the story, Yaakov is actually placing his faith in his intelligence, in his ability to practice deception, that he could hold his own with Lavan. Now here, this would be objectionable. Even if we would say that Yaakov was concerned, Shema Yigrem Hachet, and therefore felt he couldn't rely on the Ribono Shel Olam, so it would have been appropriate for Yaakov to be fearful, to daven, there would have been legitimate responses. But for Yaakov to say, don't worry, no problem, I'm his brother in trickery, I can hold my own with Lavan, seems to be placing his trust in his own superior intelligence. And that's what the pasuk says. Over hagever, Asher yiftach bo adam v'som basar's ra'o, me Hashem yasser libo. Cursed is the person who places his faith in flesh and blood and turns away from the Ribono Shel Olam. It would seem this is a terrible chisaron. And it would seem that it is just this nakuda that changed over the 20 years. Because if we go fast forward to the end of the 20 years, what does it say there? It says that finally when Lavan and Yaakov have their last encounter, right? Yaakov Avinu escapes with his family and Lavan follows in hot pursuit. What does Yaakov finally tell Lavan? His last words, or almost his last words, are Lulei Elokei Avi, if not for the God of my father, Elokei Avraham Upachav Yitzchak Hayali, Ki Ata Rekam Shlachtoni, you would have sent me away empty-handed. That whatever wealth I was able to amass, it's only because of the Ribono Shel Olam's help. You would have cheated me, you would have deceived me, and you would have sent me away empty-handed. So it seems that there's an amazing transformation. 20 years before, he says, don't worry, me and Lavan, I can hold my own with him. After 20 years, he says the truth, that if not for the Ribono Shel Olam, I'd be empty-handed. It's only the Ribono Shel Olam, through his intervention, that I was able to walk away with anything. So perhaps we should assume that this is the change that was meant to take place. In other words, that rather than assuming, because of his successful encounter with Esav, that he could rely on his own wits, after 20 years of dealing with Lavan, he understood that, to the contrary, that he has to place his trust in the Ribono Shel Olam. If not for the Ribono Shel Olam's intervention, he'd walk away empty-handed. And that really is such a critical lesson that we need to learn in Golus. In Golus. The Gemara says in Maseches Megillah that Kol Makom Shegolu Yisrael, wherever Klal Yisrael went into Golus, Shechina Imayim, the Shechina went into exile with them. Golu Lubavel, Shechina Imayim, Golu Lumadai, Shechina Imayim. Wherever we went into Golus, the Shechina is with us. And the Maral says in the Sefer Netzach Yisrael, what is the meaning of that statement? Wherever Klal Yisrael goes into Golus, the Shechina is with them. He says like this. He says that in Golus, there is a special danger. You know, in Eretz Yisrael, it's our own place, there's a certain security. But when we're in Golus, there's a very great danger. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects us. And that's why the Shechina is manifest in Golus in ways that it isn't manifest in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, it's not as apparent. So in Golus, when we clearly are at the greatest risk, and nevertheless we're protected, that's the sign that HaKadosh Baruch Hu fully protects us. It's not our brains, and it's not our diplomacy, and it's not our money. But we are totally dependent on the Ribono Shel Olam's protection, and therefore it could be that that is the change. That's what Yaakov Avinu was meant to learn over the 20 years. That whereas in the beginning, again based on his experience with Esav, he was confident in his own abilities. Over the 20 years of dealing with Lavan, he came to understand how dependent he was on the Ribono Shel Olam, and that could be the change that was meant to happen. Now the Ramban says in many places in Chumash Bereshis, there's the concept of Maisa Avasim and Lubonim, that the experiences of the Avos foretell and foreshadow the experiences of the children. And since, as we said, this is the parsha of Golus, we should expect that there's some aspects of this Golus which also repeat themselves, so to speak, on the national level later in Jewish history. I want to share with you an amazing, amazing Ramban. There's a Ramban in Parshas Kisovo. And the Ramban is speaking about the curses of the Teichacha. And it says that in the curses of the Teichacha, there'll be locusts, which will consume the crops, and the crops will fail, and the trees will drop their fruit, and all sorts of terrible calamities in agriculture. The animals will die. So the Ramban writes like this: V'da, you should know, ki ha-teichachais, all these teichachais of dever, of plague, and the trees losing their fruit, and so on and so forth, are only in Eretz Yisrael. Are only in Eretz Yisrael. Once we go into Golus, we don't find any more of these curses. We don't find locusts, we don't find dever, we don't find plagues, we don't find these supernatural illnesses. Once we go into Eretz Yisrael, we don't have that. In the Golus, we don't have that. What we have in Golus, the only thing the Torah tells us in Golus is that we'll be scared of the Gzeiris that the Umas Ha'olam will be geyser on us in Golus. That we're scared of. But the supernatural crop failures, drought, illness, that we don't have in Golus. It's an amazing observation the Ramban makes, and he goes through the Psukim and shows that this is evident from the Psukim. That only in Eretz Yisrael these calamities are foretold. Once we go into Golus, so then we're at risk of the Gezeiras of the Umas Ha'olam, but we don't have the supernatural illnesses or plagues anymore. And the Ramban says like this. The Ramban says, Aval achrei heyoseinu b'Golus. Once we're in Golus, ba'artzos eveinu, in the lands of our enemies, lo niskalu masi yadeinu. The works of our hands are not cursed. V'lo alufeinu, not our herds. V'astros seneinu, not our flocks. V'lo karmeinu v'zeiseinu, not our vineyards and our olive groves. V'ashenizra basada, and not that which we plant in the field, grain. Avlo nachnu ba'arotzos, kishar ha'amim yoshvei ha'aretz hahi. We live in those lands just like the local inhabitants, like the citizens. O b'tayv mehem, and often we are even better off than they are. We're more successful than them. Shirachim avaleinu, Hashem has mercy on us. Ki yeshivaseinu b'Golus hi b'haftacha. Because when we live in Golus, we are the beneficiaries of a divine haftacha, which is written in Parashas B'chukosai, Sha'amar Lonu, which Hashem said, Va'af gam zois, and this also, b'yoisam be'eretz eiveim, when they are in the land of their enemies, lo ma'astim, I have not scorned them, lo ga'altim, I haven't rejected them, l'chaloisam, to finish them off, lo hater brisi itam, to cancel my covenant, ki ani Hashem Elokeim, for I am Hashem, their God. So the Ramban says an amazing thing, that in Golus, there is a special haftacha that our efforts in agriculture, in farming, herding, will be successful. Nowadays, perhaps in business, will be successful. And the only thing we have to fear are the gzeiros of the Umas Ha'olam, the oppressive decrees of the governments under which we live. But in terms of success, in terms of what we grow and what we produce, that teichach only comes in Eretz Yisrael, not in Golus, and that's because of this divine promise. And first, I have to understand that l'chora, if there's a divine promise that we're going to be successful in Golus, why should it only apply to these natural agricultural calamities? Why shouldn't it apply to the Gezeiros of the Umas Ha'olam? How do you split the two and say that in Golus you don't have to worry about plagues and drought and the trees dropping their fruit? All you have to worry about is that the governments shouldn't impose harsh decrees. Why? Because we have a divine promise. So we have a divine promise. So how do you split? Why is it that this we're not at risk of, and this we are at risk of? I think the answer is Al-Pi, another famous Ramban. There's a famous Ramban on Parashas Achrei, which quotes the Gemara in Ksubas, which says, Kol hadar be'eretz Yisrael, ki ilu yesh lo elokah. If a person lives in Eretz Yisrael, it's as if he has a God. Kol shadar b'chutz la'aretz, if he lives in chutz la'aretz, ki ilu ein lo elokah. It's as if he doesn't have a God. Now, it's interesting that the Gemara in Ksubas learns this from a pasuk in Parashas B'chukosai. But the Ramban in Parashas Achrei brings a Tosefta in Maseches Avodah Zarah, which learns it from a pasuk in our parsha. It says in the pasuk that Yaakov Avinu says that if you bring me back to Eretz Yisrael, v'hoya Hashem li le'elokim, mashma that Hashem is only Elokim if you bring me back to Eretz Yisrael. But if I remain in Chutz La'aretz, it won't be v'hoya Hashem li le'elokim. So that the Tosefta says, you see this idea, if a person lives in Chutz La'aretz, if he has no God. So the Ramban says, what does it mean? It means like this. That Eretz Yisrael is a land which is totally under the direct control, the direct hashgacha of the Ribono Shel Olam. Chutz La'aretz is under the Sorim, under the various guardian angels. If you want, you could say it's under the laws of nature. Now, just to illustrate this point, we said many times the very beautiful Rashbam in Parshas Eikev, which says The Pasuk says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells the Yisrael Moshe tells Bnei Yisrael that Eretz Yisrael is not like Eretz Mitzrayim. Asher tizra zaracha v'shkisa b'raglecha kagan hayarak. That in Mitzrayim you plant your seed and you irrigate it using foot power. You draw the water and you schlep the water and you water the plants. But Eretz Yisrael is different. Eretz Harim of the coast. It's a land of mountains and valleys. L'mitara shemayim tishtem royim. It drinks by the rain. So the Rashbam says that Eretz Yisrael is the best land for Osei Ritzono and the worst land for Ovrei Ritzono. Why? Because in Mitzrayim it's all a function of your effort. You have to irrigate. You work hard, you'll be successful. Don't work hard, you won't be successful. In Eretz Yisrael, it's all a function of your schus. If you're deserving, because you're Osei Ritzono, Hashem will send the rain and you'll be successful. If you're not deserving, there'll be no rain, you won't be successful. But this is one aspect of this distinction, that Eretz Yisrael is totally under the hashgacha of the Ribono Shel Olam. Mitzrayim and other lands operate in accordance with laws of nature. So even though there's a haftacha that Hashem says, Lo ma'astim, lo ga'altim, I won't scorn you, I won't reject you, I won't abhor you. That means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to send a special intervention. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to send a special curse. Things will follow the natural way. So what is the natural way? Well, the natural way is if you plant, things grow. Right? That there should be a dever and a plague and a magefa and all sorts of supernatural illnesses. That's not b'derech hateva. So Hashem promises, I'm not going to send a natural intervention, a supernatural intervention, I should say, to bring calamity upon you. So therefore, in Eretz Chutz La'aretz, if you plant, things will grow and you'll prosper, b'derech hateva. But b'chira chavshis, that people can exercise free will, that also is a natural phenomenon. So if the Umas Ha'olam choose to impose harsh gezeiros on you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu won't interfere with that either. In Chutz La'aretz, everything goes with the derech hateva. So Hashem's promise is, I'm not going to intervene in a supernatural way. Everything will follow the natural course. What's the natural course? If you plant, you'll succeed. Right? The Umas Ha'olam will make gezeiros. That's all natural. In Eretz Yisrael, which is totally under the hashgacha of the Ribono Shel Olam, so then there's no such promise. Things will follow the natural. There is no natural order. So in Eretz Yisrael, there'll be plagues and illness and drought, all these things. But in Chutz La'aretz, where there's a natural order, it's Kamisha Ein Lo Elokat, under the Memshalas Hasarim, so there things follow the natural order. What is the natural order? That again, there are no supernatural diseases, but on the other hand, the Umas Ha'olam are free to make their gezeiros. But this is the nature of Golus. And this is an amazing thing. See, we think of Golus, we think of the Golus Bavo, of people being carted off in chains, and that's true. That's how they were brought to Babel. But once they were in Babel, they thrived. The Jewish community of Babel thrived to the extent that when permission was given to come back to Eretz Yisrael, a very small fraction of you wanted to return. 40,000 wanted to return. Everyone else wanted to stay. Everyone else did stay. Because it was comfortable, it was good. And to a certain extent, the Golus of North America is certainly that way. Right? Who's going to Eretz Yisrael? Only people that are very committed in a religious sense. But no one is going to Eretz Yisrael because of persecutions. And certainly no one is going to Eretz Yisrael because of drought, famine, etc. Because we are successful in whatever we do in Chutz La'aretz, and people have achieved tremendous wealth and success here. The truth is that the Golus of Yaakov in the house of Lavan is exactly the model for this type of Golus. You think about it, that the Golus of Yaakov in the house of Lavan, this was the place where Yaakov's family was established. Where, except for Binyamin, all his children were born. This is the place where Yaakov achieved great wealth, great success. Now it's true that later on he forfeited all that wealth. We'll read in Parshas Vayishlach that all the wealth of Chutz La'aretz he gave to Esav to buy his share in the Maras Machpelah. Apparently he felt that was a good deal. But Al Kapanim, he did come back to Eretz Yisrael with great wealth. And he himself told this to Esav in next week's Parsha. He said, when I crossed the Yarden leaving, all I had was my walking stick. I had nothing. Right? I came back to 2 large camps of cattle and livestock and servants and children, wives. In other words, he was very, very successful in the derech hateva. What did he suffer from? He suffered from the persecutions of Lavan, the treachery of Lavan, the cheating of Lavan. That, the Rambam says, is exactly the nature of Golus. That in Golus, There are no supernatural diseases, there's no blight, there's no famine, there's no locusts. Everything follows the Darchei Teva and will be successful, and even more than them, as was the case. Yaakov was more successful than Lavan. Right, to the extent that the Bnei Lavan were jealous of him. They said that he's becoming rich off our property. So we were more successful than the locals. So, but on the other hand, we were persecuted by Lavan. This is the paradigm of what Golos is. So the Maisa of a Simon Labanim, the events that occur in the lives of us actually do foretell and foreshadow that which would happen to us later in Jewish history.